fourth of our series of tag talks, which will hopefully go on month by month and involve lots of interesting subjects and diverse topics, including a few debates. We've had one on ornaments so far. We plan to have more of those, as well as members and other interested people giving talks about their own work or interests. And Radek kindly has volunteered to talk about a lot of research he's done on Bulstrode Park, which we'll talk about in a minute, but a little introduction from me about him, and then I'll let him take over and present to you his research. So Radek's been working at Pegasus since 2001, and he's been involved in various landscape planning works on strategic residential developments, planning appeals, and paragraph 79 houses, and renewable energy schemes. He specialises in landscape and townscape visual assessment and design in the context of historic buildings, hence why he's a member of TAG. In addition to Bulstrode Park, he's involved in the design of a replacement dwelling in the open countryside near Chipping Norton, designed in a classical style, which sounds intriguing. I'll have to learn more about that another time. And he's worked on the planning application for the redevelopment of CEMEX headquarters, which is the Ted Cullinan purpose-built and listed office intermingled with the listed buildings, Georgian and Victorian. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Radek and give him the floor, and we'll chat afterwards when he's finished and take any questions. So thanks, Radek.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon, for the introduction, and good evening. The main reason for this presentation is really to share the knowledge about Bulstrode Park and the historical evolution of the park. And I thought it would be a shame to lose it and leave it as my master's dissertation and without sort of spreading the love, if you like, because I found this site extremely interesting and history fascinating. And when I spoke to Diana about this presentation, she suggested to include some elements of architecture, which obviously would be probably more interesting for TAG members than just purely landscape design. So I've tried to include maps and photographs, but obviously I'm not an architectural historian, so do forgive me if I make mistakes, and I'm more than happy to sort of have a nice chat after the presentation, so you can correct my mistakes, and it will be I think it will be education for all of us, hopefully. So I first got involved in a project in sort of mid-2017 when we were the company I worked for at the time were approached by Nick Charles of Charles and Saltzman. They're based in Bristol, and they just called me and they said, "Oh, are you interested in joining us as part of the design team?" And to be honest, at the time I didn't really know much about Bulstrode and never heard of it, to be honest. So Nick said, "Well, it's a historic park and garden, and we've got this, Gothic manor house," and obviously I instantly said, "Well, yes, please, of course." So we did some research, and by the time we got appointed, and I think we were competing against Colvin Mockridge, which is sort of local as well to Cirencester, where I'm based. The significance of the site became quite apparent, and the whole sort of complexity of it really grew and throughout the project. And we were lucky; we got the planning approval in late 2018, and then I carried on with Bulstrode Park as part of my master's at the University of London. There's a wealth of knowledge, lots of information from primary and secondary sources, which interestingly, some of them are not that accurate. So it was quite a learning curve to me as a garden historian, and I'll try to remember and mention where those discrepancies are, because I think that would be quite interesting to know and maybe gain your point of view, which hopefully you'll be able to clarify on some of them. Let me just admit. So from a planning perspective, I'll give you a little background. It's in the Metropolitan Green Belt, and obviously the NPPF says that any build form is inappropriate by default with certain exceptions. So we had to deal with the issue of build form volume, but also its permanence and sense of openness. So we had a landscape and visual impact assessment assessing the development, and luckily we were able to prove that views are extremely restricted. they're very close range, and in most of those views we were able to argue that we are improving the scheme, improving the landscape, and enhancing it. Obviously we're bringing the underused or disused build form and register park and garden to new use, bringing new use of life. So hopefully you can appreciate how it's sort of evolved, and I will be talking about the design at the very end. I just want to show you the sort of linear evolution of Bulstrode Park and sort of finishing with a landscape master plan and some sketches. Luckily, there were a number of old buildings on site, mostly well, 20th and 21st century, and they were sort of more or less in this northern part of that building complex. Not particularly interesting, of no heritage significance whatsoever, so that helped balance the issue of volume in the greenbelt. So one of those sort of more important aspects of development within greenbelt were fairly easy to actually satisfy. That's the, for the context, that's the view of the manor house from the south, so that's the garden elevation, and this sort of isolated red brick building, which you can see to the left of the main house, is called the Pigeon Keep, and we'll be talking about that quite a lot. Just for the context, these are the main features or elements within Bulstrode Park. That's the core of the designation, if you like, which is obviously a non-statutory designation. The house itself is listed, it's grade 2. Park and garden is grade 2 star, and I suppose it's simply because of its complexity and evolution from 1680s throughout to early 20th century, which I will not be talking about the 20th century simply because of lack of time. As you can see are remnants of the early 1700s. And obviously number 6 is the manor house, number 5 is the courtyard, that's the 19th century. Number 2, which are in this part, surrounded by this belt of trees, that's the late 20th and 21st century development, block of flats, warehouses, and office space, which is associated with previous occupiers of Bulstrode Park, which was a Christian charity that was the sort of conference centre and main European centre for events and exchange of information, and they had guests from all over the country and all over the world, actually. I think it will be really interesting for you to see site photographs to really understand the context of the manor house and how we managed to argue that visual effects as part of this landscape visual impact assessment are very limited. So if we take those 4 viewpoints in turn, starting from the south, top image is the panorama. So you're looking sort of north across this sort of very shallow valley, wooded sort of escarpment to the right. That's the edge of Gerrard's Cross, completely not really visible at all, apart from some rooftops from time to time. To the left, behind all this woodland, is Bulstrode Manor House. The bottom image is a view sort of halfway through that, halfway along that path, which is a public right of way. Therefore, we took that into account as a high sensitivity visual receptor. Again, Bulstrode Park, the manor house, is behind all those big, beautiful oak trees, and this sort of vertical trees are one of the sort of ornamental evergreens, which is part of the sort of arboretum landscape, if you like, which is late 19th century. Moving forward, the top image is the very edge of Gerrard's Cross, which is there's a public footpath connecting residential development, and you can walk across this stuff, improved pasture. There's quite a few public rights of way, but obviously Bulstrode Park is not accessible to the public, and probably won't be for the next year or two until it's going to be developed into a hotel. The bottom image is the entrance from A40, and that's fairly recent. That's 1940s when the site was occupied by RAF, and they basically punctured through the landscape of this access of the A40, obviously for ease of communication and circulation. This is quite sort of abstract, I suppose, but it's from my point of view very informative plan, simply because you can see the landform and the contours are quite exaggerated, simply just to highlight differences and identify any minute changes that are man-made. So to the right, you have the Iron Age hill fort. Those weird oblong shapes are building platforms, so that's the edge of Gerard's Cross. Then we've got the valley, obviously coloured green, and this platform in red to the left is Bulstrode House, with, you can see the terraces, two sunken parterres, and another sort of little valley, and this sort of diagonal north-south strong line, which is a ha-ha, and I'll try to mention it later, but the most important as an early stage of evolution of Bulstrode Park are those two diagonal lines, one going sort of east-west, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, hopefully yes, and then one diagonal sort of northwest to southeast towards the encampment. And I'll talk about those lines later during this presentation. That's Bulstrode Park, and it's not very flattering, the description by Nicholas Pevsner. He said it's a pile of red brick, quite overwhelmed by the stables, which you see at the bottom image, and he wasn't very flattering, to be honest, about the whole sort of architecture. But you can make up your own mind. I found it quite interesting and intriguing almost. But I suppose the more you read, the more you can appreciate the complexity of how it changed. So the top image shows you the forecourt, sort of asphalt and gravel, bit of grass. To the right, you've got the retaining wall, which is enclosing the kitchen garden from the late 19th century. The top image is the sort of main part of the building, if you like, with the western elevation sunken parterres, and the central image at the bottom is the Pigeon Keep from the first floor, with the avenue behind, which again I'll explain a bit more in a minute. I think it's fair to say that the history of Bulstrode Park started with Judge Jeffreys. So that's a really, really intricate map by John Fisher, and that's 1686, and you can find it in Centre for Buckinghamshire Studies in Aylesbury. It's a really, really interesting and lovely map to look at, and you'll be able to handle it absolutely fine. They allow people to access this archive without any problem. Those two sort of elevation drawings are quite interesting, especially when you compare with the floor plan. And Jeffrey was apparently building a house that already stood at Bulstrode Park, and apparently it was Elizabethan in design. But there's this sort of debate whether the building existed, because during the restoration, the building suffered major fire damage. So researchers are not really quite sure that that building really existed, although later cartographic evidence suggests that some parts did remain, and it was mostly to do with the old hall, quite ornamental, and cupola on top, which is quite characteristic, and we'll see that in later plans. That's a little sort of zoom in extract of the plan. I just really wanted you to sort of take in the level of detail and beauty of this map, because I thought it's absolutely fascinating. The lettering and all those sort of, intricate decorations on this map is absolutely fantastic. Going back to the building, so we've got the main. If you look at the floor plan, in dashed white is outlined what I think is the old hall. Is what Judge Jeffrey was rebuilding and sort of retained as part of his scheme, with obviously cupola on top. You can see that quite clearly at the bottom. And then apparently he constructed two wings, the southern and eastern wing, which you can see part of it is on the left top image. That's the eastern wing with more sort of ornate entrance, and it sort of nicely fits with the plan in terms of fenestration and access. And unfortunately, the way it's organized on the actual map, it's not really that clean to rotate the building to really analyze and be able to kind of understand that, yeah, both elevations actually fit the floor plan. Don't really know why Fisher didn't organize the survey more sort of easier way. And I suspect, although that's not really substantiated by any research, is that the house perhaps was never finished, because it's quite bizarre that Fisher decided to focus on the main on the retained old hall. So obviously you can see it quite clearly with the two sort of courtyards, but you don't really see the eastern and southern elevation, which is quite, I think it's quite bizarre. You know, if you're rebuilding a manor house and you're investing all that time and money, but you're not willing to show it, there's something to, I think, to discuss. But unfortunately, for that period are quite limited and quite difficult to find. Therefore, I didn't really have a chance to properly analyze this stuff, this theory about the evolution of Geoffrey's house and whether actually it had been completed at when Fisher came and did the survey. What's interesting about Fisher's map is, again, there's the level of detail. You can see the hedgerows and trees, and every single parcel has been labelled, and you can see hedgerows, you can see all farm buildings with detailed elevations. It's absolutely fantastic. So I thought I'll show you those few extracts for you to kind of appreciate the beauty of this map, because I think it's absolutely fantastic. This is again, I try to compare the floor plan with Fisher's map, just to highlight those few points where I think there's something's not quite right with the map and the floor plan. Both sort of images, the top and bottom is the same. It's just to contrast in case you struggle to see, because the map is quite faint and it's obviously heavily enlarged. So to the left, you've got the floor plan, the courtyard as drew based on Fisher's map, obviously, overlaid, so obviously sort of false perspective on the actual view of the old house. And then to the right, you've got the sort of highlighted elements that are missing from the floor plan. It looks like those maybe ornamental gardens. They're missing from the floor plan. And then when you look at the distance between the buildings in plan and in Fisher's view, obviously there's no room for them. So it's quite, again, another question mark. What's happening with the building, whether it's been finished, or perhaps it was sort of, a vision, because there's a stipulation that Fisher was Judge Geoffrey's architect as well, not just a cartographer. One really interesting aspect of Bulstrode is also the fact that the site was owned by another individual, and he was a sheriff of Buckinghamshire. Owned Bulstrode for about 10, 12 years, and then he purchased Manor of Durham. And he built this beautiful house, which is quite sort of similar, and obviously that's typical of the period, but you can see, you can see how you can start comparing the layout in the building between this one and Bulstrode Park. And it's quite sort of interesting to sort of start thinking whether the Bulstrode was actually Sir Roger's Hill manor house, and he actually built the Elizabethan part of the house, left it, Judge Geoffrey came, purchased it, and was adding his eastern southern wing. And again, it's something for further research, and I think as always with any sort of historical research, it's I think it'll be quite tricky to confirm whether sort of my theory is correct or perhaps completely flawed. So going back to that topography plan I showed you, the exaggerated contours, I mentioned those few diagonal lines. So I did a bit of sort of analysis in software, and this is, to the left you have a LiDAR hill shading mapping, and to the right is Fisher's map. And you can quite clearly see that some of those lines match really well with the eastern approach to the house, Judge Geoffrey's house, and the diagonal line is one of the footpaths that actually led from Gerrard's Cross, which back then was nothing but a village, and connected to the house. And again, you can see the ha-ha quite clearly, very strong, and this sort of curved line is the second Duke of Portland phase, which is really nice, to be honest. These are one of the only engravings from that period. That's early 1700s. It's suggested that it's 1725, 1730, but obviously it's quite difficult to state that with any precision. Bulstrode Park was purchased by Bentinck, who came from Holland with William III, and that was his manor house in England, but he spent quite a few years in France as an ambassador, and also he spent quite a few years in Holland. So again, this sort of debate to what extent he was involved in the design of the house, whether he spent more time abroad, therefore Bulstrode Park was not as well developed, and maybe this etching is simply a vision. And again, I think it's quite clear that some of the elements were implemented for, obviously, you know, if we go back to the first image, I showed you the aerial image of Bulstrode Park, you can see the long canal to the left, the main sort of pond, circular shape on that engraving with radiating paths. So that's quite clear that obviously that part of it was implemented, but everything else is a bit sort of debatable and hasn't been really confirmed, simply because there was no need, there was never a need to analyze the site or do any geophysics across the garden. So at Bulstrode, Bentinck employed his deputies who worked with him at Hampton Court. So we've got William Tolman acted as architect, George London worked as his chief gardener with the support of Henry Wise. And none of this has been really confirmed. This is only, again, a stipulation and information that's been repeated in various sources, mostly obviously secondary sources, published books in the 20th century. There's also a possibility that Claudius God was involved in the design simply because Bentinck was obviously the ambassador to France. He was trying to convince Renaud to come and work on Windsor Castle. Renaud, being quite old, sent his nephew, and there's again this sort of theory that Claudius God was also involved. He certainly was involved in other works in the country, so judging Bentinck's status in the country being close to William III, highly likely. These are zoomed in extracts from those two, from this etching, just for you to kind of have a look at the level of detail and all the information. I'm not going to discuss them because, you know, what you see is quite evident. Another one. That's the, I suppose I need to mention on this one, that's the wilderness that's been cut in through the coppice that was owned by Judge Jeffrey. So there's this theory that the ornamental part of the garden, Bentinck's garden, was really the sort of ornamented coppice. And I suppose it's quite possible because at the time, sort of wiggly paths and that sort of, you know, picturesque approach was emerging. It wasn't quite sort of Kent or Repton, but it was sort of very, very new. Again, like I said before, Bentinck being the ambassador in France, had a chance to see those sort of, you know, wiggly wilderness layouts in various places. What is really interesting is also this image where you can see this horseshoe path with clearly what was grass banks and topiary pond, ornamented parterres, and bower and arbors and ornamental gardens. And in the corner of the image, you can see the productive part of the garden, the kitchen garden. And if we look at this little building, obviously we've got this retaining wall with pleached trees, most likely fruit trees, taking the advantage of the southern aspect. And if we just pay attention to this building, because that's quite important. And I'll mention that in a second. Again, this comparison between the Hampton Court, which is obviously the same the same era, exactly the same years really, as Bulstrode Park. You can see similarities, and it's quite clear that therefore the theory that Wise, London and Town were involved is highly likely, actually. The top image is the own garden in Holland. And you can quite clearly see the similarities between those grass parterres and the top one, which was facing very close to the house. Moving on, that's this is another etching of the same period by Bowes and Wilson, and I think when you start comparing those etchings with Knipler-Kopf, then obviously they're completely different quality. They're not as detailed and they're not as sophisticated. But this one is really important because you can, in the center of the building, you can see these more ornate part of the house, and that's the supposedly Elizabethan part of the house, the Judge Jeffreys house, the part that he was rebuilding. And obviously, architecturally, well, hopefully you'll be able to clarify this for me, but you know, you can see it's quite different. So the southern elevation is very similar to Judge Jeffreys and almost unchanged, apart from obviously changes in the levels and steps and retaining walls and enclosure. But this center part of the house is really, really important because it proves that Jeffreys' house was actually built, and it did survive till quite late. Rather busy image, but I hope you can identify. Obviously, we've got the engraving from early 1700. The blue line is the outline of the garden as existing during the era of second Duke of Portland, and the reason why I'm comparing those two layouts will be quite clear later. And the red overlay is Judge Jeffreys' layout, and you can clearly see the elevation matches the footprint, the floor plan, and even the avenue. That's a dashed line that goes to east-west is the edge of the wilderness, which again proves the point that Benting's wilderness originated as productive coppers during Judge Jeffreys' era. And this image is really to sort of go back to the existing situation of Bulstrode and show that those elements from Benting's era are still in place. The long canal, which unfortunately is in different ownership, so you don't really see it. There's just sort of quite a harsh boundary here, so small fence, but quite heavily wooded, so you don't really see anything. This path is one of the avenues that form the northern edge of the wilderness, and this at the very bottom is that diagonal line is the southern edge of the wilderness and the southern edge of Judge Jeffreys' coppers. This here is the Harhard, is the one I mentioned, is very strong sort of north-south line, and this sort of smooth, gentle line is the drive that was shown on the LiDAR hill shading. Benting obviously sold Bulstrode, and well, actually, no, I do apologize. He didn't sell it. It was inherited by his son, first Duke of Portland, and the layout didn't really change that much, apart from one minor obvious change, which you can see the water feature at the very bottom, which is quite linear and doesn't really match the engraving from the early 1700. So it wasn't first Earl of Portland that sort of introduced that. That must have been the first Duke. And another map, which is of similar era, is of 1750s, if I remember correctly. And again, you've got this sort of subdivision in the garden. The water feature is suddenly split into two, and we'll have another plan which kind of explains what's happening around the southern part of Bulstrode Park. So the second Duke of Portland, I think that was, I think it's fair to say that it was one of the sort of, not necessarily turning points, but quite drastic change in the layout. There was obviously the ornamental part, the very heavily geometric and rigid layout of Bulstrode disappeared completely, and there was it all became it all was changed in about 1750, 1757, and is actually recorded in letters by Mr. Laney, who was obviously was a very close friend of the family, lived at Bulstrode for about 6 months, a year during summertime. In winter, obviously, she was escaping to London for better living conditions. But it's confirmed that the whole sort of ornamental part of the garden, the horseshoe layout, the sunken parterres and the water was taken down. It was put to lawn, and the eastern courtyards were completely removed with this sort of oval approach, and obviously sort of enclosure, highly likely some sort of perhaps fence, not necessarily ha-ha. There's no evidence that there was a ha-ha at this stage, but definitely some sort of enclosure. Zoomed in option just for you to kind of identify again this sort of diagonal avenue, which is quite similar to the previous plans. Please ignore this sort of dashed line. That's basically a division between two parishes. It just happened that Bulstrode at the time was laid into different parishes. Overlay just to analyse and confirm how Bulstrode Park evolved, and we've got Judge Jeffrey's layout, obviously in red, against second Duchess or second Duke and second Duchess of Portland improvements, and you can see how the house became enlarged, and obviously slightly. Most of it is almost the same. It's just this sort of western wing that was added at the time, and based on the information I managed to find, it was Steve Ledbetter who was employed by second Duke about sort of 1740s, and he made those substantial changes to the house. But again, most of the elements of first Earl, the canal, the ponds were retained. It's just really the house that was the main change, and the heavily ornamented and geometric gardens that became obviously obsolete with the fashion changing. It was completely different, more naturalistic, and we coming into sort of Kent and Repton, and it's quite easy to understand why they decided to change that. This is the southern part of Bulstrode. This is the what was in the past this sort of second linear water feature. Obviously split. We've got the menagerie, and we know that the second Duchess of Portland was known for collecting shells, seashells, collecting animals, birds, everything that was alive, really. And there's a courtyard. One of the buildings was apparently finished in sort of like a Chinese pavilion, and this small feature here between those two water features is what is likely to be the grotto built by Miss Delaney, and there are letters confirming that it was Miss Delaney who designed it and was supervising the works. And it's really, really interesting reading all those letters and details about how the work progressed, that she was quite eager to see it finished, has zeal to see it finish, progress as the grotto became more complete. This is one of the animals kept by second Duchess, which was described as neither rabbit nor hare nor squirrel, and it was a Brazilian Java hare, which was obviously imported from Brazil, and there's a connection between certain individuals who in sort of 1740s traveled to America, both north and southern, and they collected seeds and brought them to England, and clearly brought some animals with them. Images are probably the only one that are at least easily identifiable and can be easily found in national archives. So we've got the top image is obviously the grotto, and that's by Grimm, Kieran Grimm, and that's about 1781. The top right is a sketch of Bulstrode Park, and it's been attributed to Miss Delaney, but I'm not quite sure that that's true, because that comment only appeared in one of the books and nowhere, and no other primary or secondary sources, so debatable. Again, it just proves the point that historical research is not that easy. You find a piece of information, and if you cannot prove that it's accurate, you need to put a question mark against it. The top image is the another Bulstrode Park. It's 73, and the bottom right is 1890, Richard Corbell, Bulstrode Park, and really lovely use of watercolored wash. And you can see the house, and so just a slightly higher, taller element is most likely the cupola, which was obviously, again, Judge Jeffrey's house. Letters are really, really interesting. So these are Mary Hamilton, which is obviously a close friend of the family, part of the Blue Stockings, and it confirms, if you can read, I went to the grotto, which was made by Miss Delaney, so obviously we've got a confirmation that it was actually Miss Delaney who designed the grotto. And another really useful reference is the reference to the grotto built by the Duke of Newcastle, and his grotto took 4 years to build, and at the expense of £10,000. And I've got a reference to it, if I can find. Yes, so in today's money, that would be £860,000, which is quite a nice sum, I think. Again, going back to this comparison between different plans, because I find it absolutely useful in trying to determine which parts are new additions, which are simply retained or altered. And you can obviously see, if we take this diagonal line, the southern extent of the wilderness and Judge Jeffrey's copse, you can obviously see that it sort of somehow matches this stuff. It makes sense to assume that this is the same line, and this stuff, the horseshoe shape is the bottom part of that sort of enclosure. So there's some, obviously there's some continuity in terms of the layout. Not that it's evident at all now, but it's nice to see that in 1784 it was still there. Talk about this image. One point to clarify: the map is Dall's map in 1784, finished 1 year before Second Duchess of Portland. So it's a really good record of what the garden looked like. And there was a suggestion that the Second Duchess, or Dowager, developed so-called American garden, with obviously at the time American species, North American, where it became a novelty and used as exotics to display in gardens, but also planned because those species, it became apparent they're quite good for woodland, and obviously they were highly ornamented, completely different from native trees in England. And this the water feature is what is called now the Lily Pond, and that's where Repton suggests the American garden was located. So the next, I suppose, stage in the development of Bulstrode Park was when the third Duke of Portland inherited the estate. He was busy improving his Welbeck estate, and he wasn't really involved in Bulstrode, although he did decide to Repton and James Wyatt to redesign the grounds. And this is John Nash's proposal, which was rejected by the third Duke instead chose designed by a more sort of castellated, more romantic version by James White, which I will show in a minute. Repton was employed apparently in sort of 1809, 1810. There's obviously, again, debate exactly when. Some people suggested 1789, and his own accounts sort of confirmed that it was about sort of 1802, 1810. Is quite interesting, and it's included in his observation on the theory and practice of landscape gardening, 1803. So we knew that this that's what Bulstrode Park looked like in 1803. He mapped 44 points on the approach to Bulstrode Park to animate the scene, to make the drive more interesting and almost enlarge the experience. And that was his device when he was dealing with estates which were not necessarily physically very extensive. So you could, by offsetting by avoiding creating this direct route, you allow the eye to travel through the landscape, especially with the topography, creating more intimate parts of the landscape and woodlands. So yeah, he devised this plan of 44 stopping points. And to the right, you've got the zoomed in extract with the obviously the house. You can see it doesn't quite match Wyatt's layout, which is quite interesting. And there's again debate which part of Wyatt's house had been completed at the time, or maybe it was again some sort of vision. But anyway, Repton's. If you can see letter C and D, sort of north of the house. C is the American garden, and again, this reference is only provided by Repton, no one else. Obviously, it's repeated in the secondary sources, but not primary sources, so that's what Repton called it, at least. D is the flower garden, and obviously we knew that the second Duchess of Portland was very interested in botany and collecting plants, and perhaps that's where her collection was placed. And F is the nursery, and separated by the Long Canal, attributed to the first Earl of Portland. The design chosen by the third Duke of Portland, Wyatt's design, James Wyatt, and based on dates attributed to those watercolors, it's again debate whether that's him or his nephew, Geoffrey Wyattville. And another question mark, and I'm hoping you'll be able to help with this, but obviously it's very different, castellated. Obviously you can see the shrubbery very, very much of the time, and really, really stuff different. One thing is quite important to mention: Wyatt's design's never been finished. Third Duke of Portland died in, I believe, 1809, owing Wyatt's large sums of money, and not really much of the house being completed. Probably mostly it was the western wing and part of the southern elevation, but not much more. So most of what you see, it was just a vision. This is quite, this is obviously Wyatt's floor plan. It's a bit tricky to perhaps see it simply because of the low resolution of the image. Most of the building, which appears slightly dark grey, is the existing building that was being incorporated by Wyatt, and his additions are this part to the left of the image. There's a slightly reddish colour, and at the very bottom when he added new elevation, a new part of the building. And if you have a look at this very edge of the drawing, that's the Pigeon Keep, the only remaining part of Wyatt's design. Everything else was demolished. And this plan proves that. It's a survey done for in containing one of the particulars, 1806, and it says the new east wing is let out as a farmyard. We've got laundries being taken down. This part of the building has been taken down. The old house to be taken down. Old furniture sold, and the new building flowed over and finished. And this, the very bottom, very corner, again, building that is habitable, so it's completed. So it's really the eastern wing, sorry, the western wing, and the very corner of the house that was fully completed by Wyatt. This is sketch that shows you which parts of the house were retained, and obviously Wyatt's design is at the back, and to the front you can see what was obviously first Earl of Portland edition, but really the core of the building was Geoffrey's house, which is obviously in total ruin on the sketch. And again, dates, they suggest it's sort of 1802. It's quite tricky to be quite precise, and unfortunately it doesn't really help in determining the clear evolution of the house. But it's a nice illustration that sort of proves the point that the survey was quite accurate. A few more plans, which are again help prove the point that the main house was destroyed at the end. But again, there's about sort of 10-15 years difference between those two plans, and obviously on the image to the left you can see almost the full house, the full extent of the build form still present, and to the right is only the western wing by Wyatt's, and to the east you've got the remaining part of Benton's house, and most likely Judge Geoffrey's house as well, obviously heavily changed. Another overlay just to help in confirming what the evolution of the house. Second Duke and Duchess of Portland in the background, this stuff overlaid with tiled map, which is obviously on, I apologize, just let me scroll, the right-hand image overlaid, and you can see obviously that part is Wyatt's house, and again that small feature is the Pigeon Keep. That's the only remaining part. The house and Bulstrode Park was eventually sold to 3rd Duke of Somerset, and then it finally went to the 11th Duke of Somerset and 12th Duke of Somerset, who employed Benjamin Ferry, and this is an image from The Builder, which is 1861, and this is the house we see at Bulstrode now. You've got obviously the tower, which was retained as a sort of living quarters. It's 2-story. It's quite tricky to get to the top because the staircase is in one of the towers, very narrow. We've got the 2 sunken terraces, which are on top of Wyatt's cellars, and you can access them. There's a small entry in one of the stuff on the side of just south of the terrace. And obviously you can see Benjamin Ferry's layout with the terraces, and that was the southern elevation I showed you at one of the first images. And this slightly this sort of image flipped for you to kind of see all the annotations on the plan, and the kitchen garden, which again, if you remember, the retaining wall I showed you at the very beginning, the red brick retaining wall, which was to the right of the image, and the what is now asphalt and gravel forecourt. Another image by illustrating the design, and it's obviously quite romantic and almost Gothic, I suppose, in a way. And what is really interesting is this feature here to the right of the house, which looks like a glass house or some sort of conservatory or some sort of outbuilding, and that was used by the design team to justify the design of a ballroom on the master plan, which you will see in a second. Another map which is sort of quite informative in the sense that it shows how the close parts of the garden have been transformed. So we've got the sunken parterres, the tower, the lily pond, one of the ponds from 1700s completely disappeared. It's only a small depression in situ. And the kitchen garden, you can clearly see with the diagonal lines, really, really interesting. And the stables, and obviously access to the east. Mostly east of 1910, 1912. Top one is the kitchen garden, the long canal. Then top right, you've got the terrace, the southern elevation with agapanthus, yeah, if I'm correct. And then the avenue, really lovely gate, which I wasn't really able to identify its location, probably between the kitchen garden and the arboretum. And the bottom right image is the veranda, the sort of southern elevation, really lovely. At the moment, well, last time I went to Bulstrode was covered in concrete flagstones, and it's quite bad really. But hopefully it will be changed soon. One of the sketches when I was trying to understand how the site works and what we can do with it. So it's rather amusing story. I prepared this plan, I think spent a few hours researching, Saturday sketching, thinking about what we can do with the site, went to a team meeting on Monday, and 5 minutes into the meeting I was told that everything needs to be changed because we need access for car parking. So so it was quite amusing, but I suppose that's how design works. You play with it and you need to be prepared to change it. This is the master plan for the site. You've got this obviously clearly ornamented but productive part of the kitchen garden. It's almost could have the quality of Soho farmhouse, where you have the kitchen garden and kind of serves two purposes. It's a sort of edible, productive garden, but also really, really ornamented and accessible to the guests. So it's not just productive, it serves two purposes. The lily pond is obviously part of the earlier scheme. What was once a large warehouse, we're hoping it will be demolished and new staff accommodation will be built in that place. Overflow car park, and the main car park is elevated because it's retained by this stuff, changing levels and retaining wall. And the idea was to have it quite open but segregated by pleached trees. So you've got this geometry which you can appreciate from the upper floors of the manor house. Obviously stables with a restaurant and cafes, North garden, heavily enclosed courtyard. We've got the whimsical garden, which is the part open, part enclosed. We wanted to retain views out to the parkland, but obviously we were dealing with visual aspect of the development. We didn't want that part of the house to be really visible because that's the new part of the house. So it was balanced with canopies. Hopefully the canopies will be undercut, lifted, allowing views out, but restricting views back to the garden environment, therefore retaining this sort of sense of openness that's so important to the green belt. We've got the sunken parterres, which initially I thought, if we go back to my sketch, I thought it would be quite fun to do this stuff, little nod to the Duke of Somerset with letter S, but turns out there was a really good design in the builder, which I had a go at and analysed its geometry, and it's still quite evident in situ. So this is really trying to restore the layouts from 1860s, let's say. And at the very bottom, you can see Gertrude Jekyll Garden, and that's a really sort of a little connection to the fact that in early 20th century, Bulstrode was owned by a Ramsden family, and Sir John Ramsden Gertrude Jekyll on growing yucca plants, which are now fairly common in our gardens, and on growing camellias. He was very interested in growing camellias, hence this idea for the camellia walk. There is a lovely certificate by the Royal Horticultural Society presented to him in, I think, 1910, which shows gold medal for his camellia. So, it's just sort of the design really back to elements that were once present at Bulstrode Park, and we've got this American garden again. So yeah, that was in short the idea for the design, and some images for the design, and a caveat that obviously is document taken from the planning application, document which was prepared not by Pegasus, by another company which I worked at the time. So just a caveat, just to make myself clear. But yeah, like I said, design is heavily influenced by past by the evolution of Bulstrode Park, that was once present, and all those elements I think tie up nicely. And obviously grasses, because they are really, really popular at the moment and very tactile. And we thought that would be quite good, especially with more ornamented parts of the garden, which need to serve, which need to be attractive all year round. And I think that's it. And I think it's been nearly an hour, so I do apologise. It's been quite.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Radek. It was absolutely fascinating. It was so much to take in, and a huge amount of work on your part. How long? How many man hours do you think you've put into this? Because it just seems like you spent your whole life researching, and it's only, like you said, it's only the tip of the iceberg. You've only investigated what you had to, not what was outside the realms of what was being altered. So much more to discover.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would love this research to be taken by someone else, or maybe PhD, and there's amazing archive at the Manchester University manuscript department, where they have letters, and part of it is in Welbeck, part of it is Manchester. It's all letters by Portland family. Beautiful source of information, really detailed, but almost overwhelming, and it's quite difficult to find information that are relevant to the garden design or to design the house, because a lot of it is private correspondence, business accounts. So you need to go through hundreds of pages in order to find one piece of information that is of use. Yeah, it's been quite a challenge to read the book. Really rewarding and really interesting. So yeah, it's only tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully this might lead to start. I mean, it could do with some funding or something maybe, and then it could sort of grow and grow. The other thing, I mean, I will open up to the floor for questions in a minute, but one quick one. Where does the name Bulstrode come from?
It's quite an interesting story. It's there's one which sort of stipulates, and I need to go back to my notes because that is actually quite important. So one of it is the old Anglo-Saxon word meaning the marsh belonged to the fort. That's, I think, the official theory and most likely accurate. There's another one interpretation which is really anecdotal and appears in quite a few websites. So when you start researching Bulstrode Park, probably you will come across those websites. And it says that Saxon Shoppington family were resisting Norman conquest, and they rode astride bulls, and because of that, the king recognized their bravery and allowed them to keep their land and gave them the name of Bulstrode. And the encampment I showed you on that topography plan, the elevated sort of oval shape, the Iron Age hill fort at the time, which is when this myth came about, I think in sort of 1840s, 1860s, people thought that Shoppington family camp was the Iron Age hill fort, because obviously they didn't, at the time, in 1850s, people didn't really understand that Britain was once occupied by Romans, and that was actually pre-Roman. So it was lack of knowledge, and they attributed that hill fort to Shoppington family. And a myth, really.
Wow. Yeah, thank you very much. We've got a question from Gail. I don't know if we can unmute Gail, but she's asking if there's a written report on the history of the house and design landscape is publicly available, or is it just what's in the planning application?
Yeah, so the planning application contains heritage assessment, which deals with the house and mostly its latter stage. So it's Benjamin Ferry, so it's the Ferry, so it's 1860s onwards and 20th century in order to justify which parts of the build form can be taken down, really, discussing things. In terms of more sort of wider analysis, that would be the sort of landscape heritage statement, which I prepared, and it's fairly brief. It's sort of more or less what I've shown you here, but it gives you the dates, gives you the names, and gives you the plans. So I would suggest, I can actually, if you bear with me, I will give you the planning application number. So it's 17 for 2017 /01750/full, and that's South Bucks. But obviously, if you go on a map search, you'll be able to identify Bulstrode Park, and you'll be able to find the planning application, and all the reports are there.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? I mean, if you have got one, either type it into the chat or unmute yourself. Feel free to and ask. I mean, I was fascinated just about how, I mean, obviously we know that fashion changes and buildings often get sort of refaced rather than completely rebuilt. I mean, this one's obviously gone for an unfortunate phase of having everything completely swept away, which is quite sort of annoying, apart from the tower at the end, which you said is a relic. But the gardens, again, as fashion changed, they obviously had pots of money and could just eradicate whole layers back to as if they never existed, which, again, I mean, you showed the one at Hampton Court, which of course they managed to do. Did they do geophys for that to kind of work out the
they did geophys,
yeah.
and they did and I did ask, actually, when I was at University of London, I tried to pursue this idea of geophys at Bulstrode, and I obtained a few quotes, but it was you know, beyond my home budget, let's say. The Garden Trust was not really they were not really they were not that interested. Perhaps I didn't sell the scheme well enough for them to engage. But I suppose, you know, now the site has the potential to be developed into a hotel. That's why I wanted to do geophys before the construction work starts, because once it's in, no one will let you into the private grounds. So, and I suppose one thing I need to say, when I mentioned that when I showed you the kitchen garden, one of the buildings and one of the walls apparently remains in situ, and is the 18th century brick which was found beneath the ground levels, existing ground levels. So whatever Repton did to the landscape, or first or second Duke of Portland, some brickwork remains in situ. It's just obviously hidden underground, but there's a potential that some of the retaining walls, some of the subdivision of the first Earl are preserved underground.
Oh, very tantalising.
Didn't really have a chance.
Because I was thinking, if they've eradicated whole sways, maybe there isn't much to, but it sounds to me like that it's all there just lurking under the surface.
Exactly. As long as they keep the ground levels as existing, it should be preserved in situ.
Excellent. Well, Jan's got a question. He's asking, how did the planning application go? Did the local authority appreciate the changing nature of the location as a mandate for contemporary change?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the Historic England sir, it's escaping, but he was very interested and very keen to see Bulstrode Park brought to new life. He was involved in the scheme nearby, and he told me that he travelled past Bulstrode Park for a number of years, and it was always closed. He knew that it's sort of, you know, underused. That Christian charity, I think they moved on and stuff. Obviously, they sold the site and stuff around 2000, I think 15, 16, but they didn't really use it at the very end. So it was basically underused, disrepair, and obviously he was quite keen to see this historic asset to be preserved. That's the best, you know, what's the better way of preserving, if not giving it a use of life, using it for something else.
Oh, excellent. Which leads on to George's question: is what stage are we at now? You mentioned it's a couple of years probably before.
Yeah, so it's a bit tricky. I think the client was very keen to carry on. We even had the idea of creating Repton's Lost Red Book, because I don't think it was ever created, perhaps was, but it's lost anyway. There's no evidence. So we thought we'd do this, but the client was very keen, and second stage so the red line was tightly drawn around the building, and the master plan was quite small. So you've got the arboretum and the rest of the parkland, which is outside the ownership boundary. But that would be the second stage. But at the moment, it's planning application approved. It's been about 2 years, so we've got 3 years to implement. So hopefully, but it's really to do with the funding. And all I can say is the client is a sort of not based in the UK. I think that just and so it makes it slightly more difficult, but they do appreciate the significance of the site, which is really good. So they really, really understand the site, and they want to see it developed. But I think there's, it's just the I think logistics and financial side prevents from moving it forward at this stage, at least.
All right, well, we can certainly hope. I mean, I'll be the first one there to book a room, I think, for a stay.
Well, same, yeah. I would love to see it developed.
Yeah. Very good. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. Any more questions from anyone? Again, either wave your hand, unmute yourself, or type it into the chat. And if there are any questions afterwards lingering, just email us and we can get back to you. So I appreciate it. We've gone on quite a long time, but it was we could have gone on longer, quite frankly. Radek, it was so much more. We could have. We got a very thank you from Matthew, and I'm sure we all share the same thing. Thank you very much for sharing some of your research and just the passion you've got for it. And
pleasure. But I would encourage you, go on the council's website, try to find the documents, because there's wealth of knowledge which obviously I didn't really have a chance to translate or tell you because of the dates and names. It's quite it's a lot to take in, and I wanted to keep it fairly simple.
Yeah. Well, it's been great. Thank you very much. So unless there are any other burning questions, I say thank you very much all for attending, and we look forward to seeing a lot of you at the next one, which will be announced quite soon, I hope. So thanks, everyone. Thanks very much. And thank you, Radek, again.
Thank you, Radek. Very much. Thanks. Very interesting. Thanks. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too.
See you around, I hope, when this is over.
Yeah, the whole COVID palaver, hopefully.
Okay. I think you're Radek, you're the one, now you're the host, I guess you're the one that can actually end it for all of us.
Okay.
Well, ready. I mean, I'm not trying to get rid of you, but
somebody.
If you want to go and have some dinner or something, just
time to go home.
Very good. Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. All. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.